The big names you know. The other guys you've never heard of. Until now. This is Around the Nest. Jay talking around the Blue Jays minor league system.
Hello and welcome into a different sort of Around the Nest as we close out a unique 2020 campaign. No minor league baseball affiliates for the Blue Jays were in action. Minor league season was canceled. The Blue Jays were in action, though. Let's go right up to the top of the ladder. Ben Wagner, the voice of the Blue Jays. Ben, first, after spring training was called and before summer camp began, did you get into any new hobbies?
That's a really good question. New hobbies, no. I think I found my passion for some hobbies left behind over the last couple of years with life as we know it, kind of in a whirlwind, at least on my end professionally and personally, moving out of Buffalo, deciding on where to live and where to transition life in season / off season. So a couple of things like coffee roasting that I'm passionate about. I left that kind of on the back burner, so to speak. And during the shutdown, I was able to pull out the roaster and, try some unique things over the course of the shutdown. And, it went from being a couple of week commitment now to a couple of month commitment. So I got to tinker a lot in the garage and, found a new running trail, found a lot of things to do during the downtime. So not necessarily anything new, but I guess a rededication to the coffee roasting, making lunch every day, fine tuning my salad, my dinner skills. So there were, my wife benefited from that, but nothing like trailblazing new. I'm not like Ross Atkins where I just decided to pick up a guitar one day and start strumming a guitar. I wish I was that talented musically, but at least it was nice to get back to a couple of things that I left behind.
It was such an uncertain sequence of events leading up to the very start of the season. Would the Blue Jays be in Toronto? Would they be in Pittsburgh? Would they be in Buffalo? You have your history in Buffalo. How is that uncertainty for you?
Well, it's kind of evil looking back at it. You spent all those years calling games in Buffalo, and the amount of reels and demos that I sent out from games that were called in that booth, it would have been, I'll be honest, it would have been very emotional for me to walk back in there, having the job that I have now, into a place that got me to that place, if that makes sense. And the memories and the history that I had there from 2000, even before 2013, with all those young Blue Jay prospects, that first year of the affiliation, it would have been an incredibly moving experience for me. Unfortunately, that wasn't the experience. And for people that don't know, the decision was made long before by Sportsnet and on the Blue Jays broadcast side to lump them in with the same processes for all the NHL properties that Sportsnet and Rogers Sports Media controls, along with the Maple Leafs. On top of that, with the Raptors, where they had no interest in sending their people to the bubble, and baseball was included in that, regardless of where the Blue Jays were going to play. The benefit that we would have had if Toronto would have been one of the hosts for the Blue Jays, at least in some capacity of a season, we would have been able to do the games from Rogers Center and see some part of the schedule live. But that was taken off the table with the federal government not approving Major League Baseball to travel in and out of Toronto, even with the modified quarantine and a system that proved in the end to work, which is, let's keep that in perspective too. Even though they couldn't play in Toronto, what the Blue Jays came up with and executed perfectly in Buffalo and all of their travels, it worked. It didn't work for us though, because we were in the studio and we called the season wire to wire. We were in the Sportsnet 590, the fan studios in downtown Toronto. Across the street on a different level is where Dan Schulman and Buck Martinez handled their 60-game schedule on the TV side. It was great because I got to commute back and forth with Joe Siddle and Buck Martinez every day because we're essentially all roommates. So there we are in the car doing our pre-production meeting and getting fired up for every broadcast in the early afternoon. And then on the ride home, we're rat-a-tat-tat about this, that, the other. I had a master's class going to work each and every day with two just tremendous individuals, plus the baseball knowledge that Buck and Joe have. And, we talked a lot about our broadcasts along the way. So it was definitely a unique experience from my standpoint, and not only gratifying professionally at the end of the day, but it was really, really fun personally too, getting to know those guys a lot better.
Just to get into the nuts and bolts of the broadcast aspect of it, how did this challenge you as a broadcaster?
Many challenges, to be honest with you. I didn't know what to expect. I had never called what they call a RIMI game. I've never done a remote broadcast before off of a monitor. I know people that have in the business, and most of them have been Olympic sport broadcasts where you're not even given nearly the amount of camera angles that you would be on a traditional broadcast of a Big Four. So I kind of sought after those guys specifically because those broadcasters would have way more challenges than somebody working at in our world, right, the Big Ten Network, because you and I both have Midwest connections, and some of their broadcasts the last handful of years have been done out of production trucks or the BTN studios. So I asked Mike Monaco, I said, how are you calling softball games out of a studio in Chicago for a game that's happening between Penn State and, let's say, Ohio State and Columbus, Ohio? And, he gave me some ways that he was able to cut corners. Major League Baseball did an amazing job providing us resources too on our end, both from a visual standpoint and also a statistics standpoint, and on the back door with a couple of different media channels that we could access through the web. So those helped us kind of round the edges on processes going into it that we weren't just really sure. There were some growing pains along the way, sure. The challenges specifically are as simple as not being able to see an umpire make a call, to also balls that get hit on a low line on the diamond. If you're in the broadcast booth or you're at the ballpark, your depth perception gives you a sense of how hard it's hit, the angle that it's hit. Is it speared on a short hop? Some of those are really, really challenging plays. Anything hit hard down the lines was very, very difficult. Anything towering high in the air. A camera, and as you consume it on television, doesn't necessarily track the flight of the ball until you go to the replays. Your standard TV broadcasts only will show you the players in motion trying to track that ball. So you don't know if it's hit hard. You can tell either by the sound or the recognition of the swing and the reaction of the batter. But even in that camera cut, that split second that it takes for somebody in a control room to jump from a center field camera to the high home camera and then try to move with the ball driven to right field, left field, center field, whatever, you're relying on instinct from what you know, watching players and racing after a ball, drifting with a ball, trying to gauge that and build your dramatic call behind that, especially on radio, where you're trying to live in that moment and call things as they happen. That is part of what I really appreciate about the way that I do the job, and other people in our business, Jesse, do their job too. Is they don't lag behind. They call the action as they're seeing it and experiencing it. So I want to be in time as Randall Gritchie goes back to the wall in center field, extends above the wall trying to make the catch. I want to call that as I'm living it, not as lagging behind and leaving that moment, because I think you lose a lot of the natural energy, especially on radio, as you're trying to carry it. So those are just a couple of really quick examples. The thing that I just could never get over too is the fact that on a pickoff move, a stolen base, you don't see or hear umpires, and a lot of times now guys just don't react. With replay, you don't get a lot of that natural emotion from players, especially on stolen bases. Guys dive in, they may not be sure they're safe or out either. Just with the natural progression of the play, where a guy doesn't feel himself get tagged. So you're trusting your naked eye, and then if you don't see the defenders try to throw it around the horn, or you see somebody pop up off the base and give an all shucks, I'm out, or a fist pump that I'm safe. You miss out that natural body language coming from the players on the field. So your call, your call is kind of left up in the air too a little bit. But if you're watching in the broadcast booth or at the stadium, you see an umpire emphatically, signal his hand safe, and you can say safe, he's in there, or something like that. So those were really challenging plays, and I felt like we got better as the season went along. And talking with people that were listening throughout the course of the year, people that I know and talk to frequently, although people that I may not talk to once or twice a year that just hear it on radio. I think the biggest compliment for our broadcast this year is we can't tell that you're not there. while we can tell many things, and there were frustrations along the way, and fortunately, because of the amazing people behind the scenes, there were very, very, very few technical glitches the entire season, which is an incredible undertaking for the people behind the scenes in Major League Baseball, the places that the Blue Jays were playing, and obviously then through Buffalo and Sportsnet, to have so few technical glitches made our job a lot easier. Made us trust going to work every day too, to be honest with you. But to hear that at the end of the day and at the end of the season, the people just saying, wow, we had no idea just listening that you guys weren't in Buffalo, because it sounded like you were there. And that's a really nice thing to hear.
Another thing that really changes is you can't be around the players and the coaches every day. You can't check in
Well,
with them by the cage, right?
Yeah, I mean that's the huge thing left behind. I mean, our access, and I look at it too, is, well, the front office, the people making decisions, the players and the coaches obviously are going to be the most in tune people with the entire process. The next wave of people that have to be as informed as possible are the people doing the broadcasts. And we get our information because of the access that we're allowed. And it doesn't necessarily mean because we travel on the plane, but we're allowed to be in the clubhouse. There's comfortability with the players and the coaches that we've got. The access around the batting cage, like you said. I take great pride in working the clubhouse, both on the Blue Jays side every day and also on the side that the Blue Jays opponent are housed, whether we're in LA, Kansas City, or, at Rogers Center. I'm going to spend some time working the room for the Blue Jays opponent too, just so I have a feel of where decisions or processes are from an opponent standpoint, because it may impact a decision that the Blue Jays are making, over the course of the game. So I always try to dive into the manager's interview session too. You don't have that. and as great as technology is, and here we're accessing something that we didn't even do in my years on Around the Nest, with the Zoom feature, and we're now putting our faces on top of Around the Nest. You don't get that comfort in those kind of private conversations with this, because whatever it is, our media settings now are group settings. There's no one-on-one conversation. And that's nice. And the Blue Jays did an amazing job giving us 2 or 3 players every day, a manager or a coach every day. We had resources available, but you lose out on those intimate conversations, where you can really dive in one-on-one and tell a story about a guy making his major league debut or the process maybe for that season. And without those one-on-one relationships, you feel like there's a disconnect. Sure. I tried like hell to make sure it didn't happen, on the broadcast. But you had to really, really work your sources this year more than ever. And that goes on both sides. So I'm calling broadcasters ahead of every series. We tried to all pile on at once. So, if it's me calling Neil Solantz in Tampa Bay, or Andy Freed with the Rays ahead of our series, or, I'm chatting with Susan Waldman, ahead of the Yankees and Blue Jays series. It seems like we were talking every day in September. We had so many games, right? And those are relationships that, thank God, we already had. Nobody had to get to know anybody, because we were already, very cordial and friendly, and haha, yuck, yuck, when we're at the ballparks in the regular season. Now it's like we pick up the phone, but we got stuff to talk about. Let's dive into this. And we're going to be on the phone for 30 or 40 minutes talking about pitching decisions that may plot out, or, how the previous couple of games went that may affect bullpen decisions, and who's hot and who's not, in the lineup, and how are the Yankees continuing to win games, without their big stars. And I mean, all those things that you would wonder as a fan, we're talking about with our colleagues, and we're trying to get a feel for Aaron Boone. And like I said, the broadcasters, our colleagues, were amazing resources. The PR people on the other side of things were amazing in sharing either the files or giving us access to dive in on Aaron Boone's pregame conversation, or the Kevin Cash's pregame media session, where maybe Kevin Cash says something and it's about Randy Arozarena, and now all of a sudden I've got a question about Randy, and I know Randy's on the checklist, so I can dive into their media session. So all those things, hopefully in this big tangled ball of twine that we've got, comes together by 6:37 in Buffalo, and we can put it together for a broadcast. So we tried to make it work as well as we could.
You mentioning talking to all those different broadcasters and media people. One of the things that I enjoy is anytime you get together with a different broadcaster, media person, you've got a story to share that has happened to you over the course of the summer. They've got a story to share that happened to them. What were the best stories that either you shared from you or that you heard from them?
Oh man. So the best story. This is, man, there are a lot of long nights in that studio. At the very tail end of the season, Randy Arozarena is just exploding, and this will tie it in because of his success in the postseason now. Randy Arozarena and Alejandro Kirk were teammates in Mexico. And there was a series at the Trop. No, it was a playoff game. It was a playoff game at the Trop. Game 1 of the wild card series. Cameras, we get access, just to give people behind the curtain, right? Our cameras are up. We see the ballpark. We see bullpens. We see a lot of things starting around 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon for a 6:30, 7 o'clock game. So not much get by our camera people, or, we get a live look at batting practice. So if there's an injury or whatever. Sometimes it's just really boring to watch, but we have it on in the background just in case something happens, or you spy a new player. And I'd be like, oh, when did that guy arrive? Like, oh, John Reed Foley's all of a sudden throwing a bullpen. So anyway, we get this access, which is great. And, I'm sitting there doing pregame stuff and whatever. I notice Alejandro Kirk behind the cage before game 1. Randy Arozarena, who's obviously this huge talking point, having great success with 7 home runs, high average through September. And they're chatting. Seeing players chat, that's nothing new. But then they pose for a picture behind home plate. I thought, well, that was kind of weird, whatever. Later on that night, the Tijuana Bulls post this photo of the two. I'm like, oh, former Tijuana players. All right, that's kind of a cool moment. I get that. I had the link anyway. But then Kevin Cash talks about Randy Arozarena after the ball game. Randy Arozarena then does a media avail the next day. And I said, hey, I saw that moment with you and Alejandro Kirk. And again, this is where the relationships between broadcasters and media people just, it pays off huge, right? You get that access and you have an opportunity to hopefully ask the right question. And I asked Randy, I said, can you tell me about, how that picture came to be? And he goes in depth through his interpreter about the first time that he met Alejandro Kirk as a 16-year-old. Then they played together in Tijuana. And remember, he has this amazing voyage to defect from Cuba too. And Alejandro, of course, is this young kid who's just blossoming onto the scene. Randy recognizes his talent. And he said, essentially, we took a picture in Tijuana behind home plate in the same pose. This picture is very, very special to me because we promised each other if we ever got a chance to play against each other or with each other in the major leagues, we would pose for a picture behind home plate, just like we did in Tijuana. And it was a moment 24 hours ago that you're like, oh, kind of cool. You see two opposing players that may have this link in their past. And then all of a sudden the next day, I asked Randy Arozarena about it, and he's talking about the talent that he recognized in Alejandro Kirk, which people in Lansing and now in the entire system know about. He talks about the moment, that they kind of made this pact to one day make it to the major leagues if they ever had a chance. And here's a kid that's 21 years of age, and Randy Arozarena is exploding onto the national, baseball scene with the September and now postseason that he's having. And it's again a tug at the heartstring moment by two players. And is it a story that may have been able to be unearthed if I notice it because I'm milling around behind home plate that day? Maybe. But again, it's a moment that you notice and you're allowed to follow up on with the modern conveniences of technology. And it becomes this great story that I got on the heels of game 1 and unfortunately a game that got away from the Blue Jays in game 2, that at least later on in the broadcast when Randy Arozarena was making a late at bat, that I could work in as a story as part of the broadcast, So that's just one of the things that really pop out and stand out. it's a funny moment with, a lot of the managers in Zoom calls with Brandon Hyde down the stretch early in September, and a reporter asked Brandon Hyde, the manager of the Orioles, what's this like? What's the season been like for you? We know what it's like covering games now on this end of things. What's it been like for you? And he goes, I'm sitting in a tent in a parking lot, getting ready to play Major League Baseball in Buffalo. It's been weird, So you try to stay lighthearted about the entire process, as removed as you are. But thankfully, everybody just was kind of going through the ebbs and the flows of a regular season, and you had those funny moments. I had great relationships that only got stronger with a lot of the colleagues. I mentioned Susan Waldman. I've got a decade plus of friendship with Will Fleming, who's in Boston, because of his ties to Indianapolis in the International League, then going through Pawtucket. Neil Solondz gave me my job in 2003 with the Lakewood Blue Claws. Now, of course, he's been in Tampa Bay since like 2009, 2010, something like that. So, we've got these long-standing relationships and some new ones too. I didn't know the guys in Atlanta very well, so I got a chance to talk to them a handful of times. So it's weird how life gives you these opportunities, and you can take advantage of certain things in unfortunate times.
I want to stick with Alejandro Kirk for just a second to allow me to ask you about the alternate site. So in Single A, that's extended spring training, which is this place where a lot of people are, and players will come from there, players will go to there, and you never know who could show up or who could go to extended. You've got the alternate site where you're receiving players, getting players sent. How much from your sources, how much are you hearing what's going on? How much are you hearing who's impressing?
Maybe the biggest accomplishment that the Blue Jays were able to do is tighten the lid on any sort of information coming out of Rochester. And that's really a tough thing to deal with too from a broadcast standpoint. And that's where Alejandro Kirk and many other of the prospects, as the summer continued to go on, were getting their reps away from the regular season roster, plus then the five-man taxi squad that they carried all year. And on that taxi squad, and I mentioned the camera angles early in the afternoon, like you would see guys just kind of like pop up. The Blue Jays went to New York, and like Josh Palacios all of a sudden like popped on the screen. I'm like, where did he come from? And I mean, he's a Brooklyn guy. Did he just like drive over and take some BP that day? So I was asking different people, and trying to channel my sources, like, changes to the roster today? Are we going to see Josh Palacios activated? Because that's a huge story. I mean, there's another guy making his major league debut. But all these guys are cycling in and out of Rochester, and they're on the flight after Buffalo, or the Blue Jays would leave Buffalo, and they would get them into the bubble that way and take away any commercial travel, or sometimes the guys would actually have to drive from Rochester to meet the ball club. So unlike a regular season where I would be able to track Alejandro Kirk's success or Griffin Conine's success because of stat sheets or game recaps that, Lansing is producing, New Hampshire is producing, we get none of that. We never got a stat sheet. Sometimes you would hear Ross Atkins or Charlie Montoyo or Pete Walker or John Schneider mention somebody that, had another big day in Rochester. And you're like, what do you mean he had another big day? Oh, yeah, Jonathan Davis hit 2 home runs yesterday in an inter-squad game. You're like, good to know. Okay. Now we got something else to talk about tonight on the broadcast. So, without channeling sources like Jesse or Tyler or Pat in Buffalo, or just looking at a stat sheet and a game recap, your thirst for this knowledge and tracking the prospects becomes even greater, because you're like, okay, like who's knocking on the door? If Teoscar Hernandez gets hurt, if Randall Grichuk goes into a tailspin or gets hurt, like who's the next man up? Because you really had no idea. And these little curveballs that you got out of Rochester, like seeing Josh Palacios all of a sudden on the screen in New York, you're like, what's going on here? So you were just waiting to see, like what the next surprise would be. So talking to the coaches, and we didn't try to overwhelm any of the minor league coaches that were there. I was talking to my 1 or 2 sources, other broadcasters that I work with. We're going to talk to 1 or 2 of their sources. And we were talking to media PR people, on the Blue Jays, just trying to get a sense of who's coming and going. just so we were ready. It had nothing to do with the fact that you want to break a story about Alejandro Kirk making his major league debut. We just want to be ready for it. And that's where all of the heavy lifting and all the conversations that I have in early February and through then the month of March really paid off. Because you want to talk to Josh Palacios about, growing up in Brooklyn and all that stuff that I was going to use during a spring training broadcast now could be part of your major league broadcast today, in that moment. Not in like a couple of years where you would expect Josh Palacios, to really push the envelope, or Santiago Espinal and his amazing story over the past year, with breakout season, obviously the struggle watching his mom and her battle with cancer. And then obviously, she passes away this off season. He goes through, becoming an American citizen, all these things, like these conversations that you're having around a cage or in a clubhouse in Dunedin in February, now all of a sudden become really, really valuable as you get to the point in the regular season where here's Josh Palacios surprising everybody and making, the roster and becoming maybe the best glove on the diamond that the Blue Jays had if he's playing short or wherever he's playing. And Santiago Espinal, has tremendous defensive skills. Would he have been if there was normalcy? No, he probably wouldn't have been there without any question. He probably would have been in AA and AAA, all season long. And with rosters even limited more now, we probably wouldn't even seen him in September. Now he becomes this amazing story and hopefully a springboard to his entire career. So all those things you're left with, thank God that you did all this hard work in February and March, early March, because it paid off so big because you didn't have an opportunity, to call to Buffalo or New Hampshire to get a guy on the phone for 5 minutes, because you heard his name maybe being rumbled about as possibly jumping onto the roster in normal times, right? Because we just didn't, you just had to fight for access. You would just have to fight for that access. So Rochester was a really interesting beast. It was, I know a handful of teams provided broadcasts of their alternate training site and the inter-squad games that were happening, and they would try to jump in and tell some of the funny things that were happening over the course of the summer from the alternate training sites. We didn't have that opportunity. The Blue Jays were one of the teams that really clamped down not only what was happening there, but even who was there. And we just had to roll with it.
Yeah, Pawtucket. I'm seeing everything that's going on. I reached out to Josh Wetzel. He's in Kansas.
Yeah, exactly. He goes, well, he's even further removed from it than we are.
Santiago Espinal was probably going to be in AA, AAA. Josh Palacios had spent the year in AA last year, was probably going to be AA, AAA. Alejandro Kirk had been in Lansing and Dunedin last year. Was it a shock when suddenly his name, and he had a great spring training, but to go from Dunedin to the major leagues?
For a guy that had a handful of professional at-bats, let alone never had an at-bat above A ball, yes, it was a shock. But what we saw in spring training with Alejandro Kirk was impressive, just the way that he handled the bat. And I remember being behind the plate with a handful of people on a day that the Blue Jays big club was playing, I think in Bradenton or maybe Sarasota. We stayed back because Ryu was going to throw in an inter-squad game. And Alejandro Kirk had at bats against Hinge and Ryu. And he saw two different curveballs. And I mean, we're right behind the plate. He saw both curveballs. He saw changeups. And he was staying with a guy that just won an ERA championship in the major leagues. And you're like, wow, this kid's 20, 21 years of age. And you even heard last year about the way that he handles the bat and, can handle himself as a professional hitter. And now you're seeing it against arguably one of the best pitchers in the game going, Hinge and Ryu. Yes, it's spring training. Ryu's out there working on stuff. But you also think in the back of your mind, like a major league caliber pitcher in no regard wants to have a 21-year-old work him over in spring training or in Game 7 of the World Series. So that competitive juice starts to flow if you're the big lefty out there. And you walked away from that moment thinking like, oh, maybe this kid does have a chance. And, sure enough, fast forward 10, 12 weeks, Alejandro Kirk, all of a sudden is in Toronto during summer camp, and then you start to hear his name being floated about because the Blue Jays had absolutely no production from their catching core. And as good as Danny Jansen and Reese McGuire were at times with the bat last year and made some advances in their defense behind the play last year, that's a position that really needed something. They needed a catch and throw. They needed something with the bat, and they just could not find it all season long. So, Caleb Joseph, what were you going to have outside maybe just a veteran presence with him? You kind of knew what Caleb Joseph is just in his body of major league work. So why not push the button and get Alejandro Kirk up here and see if he could, catch lightning in a bottle? And sure enough, early on, he did, and he did. And he never looked overmatched. He never looked overmatched at the plate. And he's just out there, and his teammates clearly love him, and he loved being around the game. And, watching the progression of him kind of make that major league debut where you saw him in Miami going over the scouting sheet and trying to track along on some of the camera cutaways where he was watching in the bleachers, to then getting onto the bench, chatting with John Schneider, going back and forth. Like you saw the momentum building to the moment where he was going to get a chance not only to play, but then start games and work with the veteran pitching staff. And his major league debut, he's trying to catch Robbie Ray, who's got some of the nastiest stuff out of the funky left arm slot. And you're thinking like, man, they are throwing everything at this kid in his major league debut and beyond. And he, you know what? He did a good job. He did a really good job.
Blue Jays as an overview, a season that ended in the postseason. Do you have a favorite on-field moment, a favorite moment from a Blue Jays game this year?
Oh, there are a couple of them. The moment that sticks out obviously is the day that the Blue Jays clinch a chance to go to the playoffs. With everything that had been thrown at the Blue Jays going back to summer camp, and there are incredible obstacles that everybody has had to deal with during this shutdown. So I'm looking at it only from a scope of sport here, and trying to celebrate as an escape for me personally, for the players that are there, to use the game that they love, and I think had a renaissance in their love of the game too at the same time for many of them. Watching the celebration for the players on the field, knowing that they clinched an opportunity to get into the playoffs, regardless of what you feel about the expanded playoffs, the wild card game, wild card series as it then came to be, the elation that you saw and this lift just disappear off the shoulders of a lot of those players, with what they had gone through, going all the way back to Toronto, what September had been. You lose Bo, you get Bo back. You lose Teoscar, you get Teoscar back. You lose Rowdy, who had an incredible season and is not being talked about enough. And then you hear rumblings of maybe he gets a chance to come back by the end of this too. Those are three significant blows and really a roller coaster through the final 3 weeks of the regular season for the Blue Jays. And to watch Charlie Montoyo smile and start to hug his coaches after that final out was recorded, you just could feel the energy coming from the Blue Jays in that moment. And you saw the energy and the elation from the players in that moment too. That is going to be, forget how the next couple of years go. That is going to be a moment that is cherished with everybody that had to go through living out of suitcases the first 4 weeks of the regular season, even to get a chance to drop a bag in Buffalo. And the question marks around the regular season at the start, would this thing even get off the ground for the Blue Jays and Major League Baseball overall? It's just another reason why, I think the most duress that any Major League team had to deal with starts in Toronto, even over the Cardinals, even over the Miami Marlins, with contact tracing and the abundance of caution that was taken with those individual teams. You always had a backup plan. The Blue Jays spent the first month of the season kind of spinning their wheels and just trying to find a home, trying to figure out what the roster was going to look like. They had injuries. They had couple of letdowns, in the pitching department, a lot of inconsistencies offensively, a lot of question marks with Vlad shifting, from one corner to the next. Was he going to play a serviceable first base? All those things, a million things happening. And what was this season going to look like? And here it is. We saw what it looked like. We saw the expression, the emotion, and the passion just pouring out of those players' eyes, their smiles, their faces, the celebrations. For the guys that had been celebrating in September as minor leaguers, like Kevin and Bo and all those guys have done, even the new guys, Taijuan Walker had a pretty awesome time, judging by his Instagram feed, celebrating with the Blue Jays and his new teammates after they had a chance to get to the postseason. So that's one of the really big moments that stands out for me. There are individual accomplishments, sure, that go out there, and some of those moments that you look back and think like that was pretty awesome here, there, and everywhere. But that's the overglossing top spot for me.
Season like that, postseason like that, just to make it. After, as you mentioned, what they went through, it has me looking ahead to next year, and looking ahead to next year with greater hope and enthusiasm. For you, how would you like to see the Blue Jays spend their offseason to propel themselves into 2021?
I think pitching is still somewhat of a concern, because the pitching that the Blue Jays have right now, if we get into any sort of normalcy in 162, there's no way that Anthony Kay, Thomas Hatch, Julian Merriweather, a lot of those guys are going to be relied on in roles that they were asked to be in with the Blue Jays this year. They're, one, labeled as starters, and two, they're going to need some time to get stretched out and develop. Likely that's going to happen if minor league baseball, and that's a whole nother question, probably another topic for Around the Nest, but whatever the landscape of minor league baseball looks like next year too will factor into that. Whether it's at a data camp down the street here in Dunedin where they're just moving players in and out, or the Blue Jays have them on the major league roster and we play 162. I think pitching is a definite concern. The Blue Jays were really disappointed in what they got from Tanner Roark and Chase Anderson. Those are two holes now in the rotation that you've got. And I don't think you automatically go to a Thomas Hatch, and you're not going to have Ryan Barucki stretched out to be out of his role this year too. So while there are depth options, there aren't everyday options for the Blue Jays to jump into that rotation. So I think, you've got to address pitching again. The Blue Jays again, like the fourth straight year, are going to address pitching. The bullpen burned out, and it was a lot of trial and error, to find guys in roles and in positions too that I don't necessarily think will pan out unless you address finding a reliable closer that you may have. And maybe Jordan Romano is that, and he comes back. He's extremely healthy. That would be a great sign for the Blue Jays if that's a guy that kind of emerges, because a closer is just such a calming presence down there if you rely on that guy and you can trust him to get some outs. You start on the diamond, they got to be better defensively. I think the outfield has a long way to go to shore up itself defensively. Can you get a true center fielder out there? I think that would help things a lot. I got questions on the corners. What do you do at third base? I don't know that Travis Shaw is going to be your answer. There's an option out there on him, but he still didn't perform, even a short sample size. I don't know that Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is your answer at first base either. And you don't want to give up on a guy that is so young in his major league career, let alone so young physically still as well. Corner infield positions are very, very important. I still think you can shore up middle of the diamond and move both. Like we found out last year when Blue Jays were kicking the tires on Francisco Lindor, they talked to Bo and said, would you be able to move off the shortstop position? And obviously he said yes, because it's going to make us better. And there's opportunity to improve defensively up the middle, and the catching game has to just come a long way. It has to come a long way in proving that they can throw out base runners, because the Blue Jays were exposed there. And the game calling just has to be better. And that goes on something that Ross has already talked about, and Mark Shapiro talked about yesterday, where they've got to throw more strikes. And too many times we were watching the Blue Jays fall behind 2-0, 3-1, and have to go in and make a non-competitive pitch just to get a strike, or you walk a guy. And too many times I think the Blue Jays pitched passively. And, whether or not you're looking down at the wristband and blaming that in this scenario, or it's just maybe not a comfort in game calling, that's a significant step that the Blue Jays have to make this offseason, is figure out, how they're going to approach a game plan and then go into execute, to pitch to a pitcher's strengths versus a hitter's weakness in my mind. So other than that, we should be rolling right into 2021 with very few questions. But, it's a team. And maybe you look at it just like you look at your team too in Lansing, and we can look at teams, that we follow so passionately. If you watch your team each and every day and you're talking to so many people about your team each and every day, you see all the warts, right? And maybe you don't appreciate how good and how special a season is. And that's why you look back at 2020 and think, man, my God, these guys accomplished so much. And they developed so much. And they took strides in so many different areas. But you're also realizing this is what it takes, to get to that next level. This is what it takes to compete with, unfortunately, still Houston. Compete with the Tampa Bay Rays, as funky as they do things, and 59 different starting lineups in 60 games in the regular season for Tampa Bay. It's incredible. What it takes to be elite, even in adversity, like it was with Atlanta, or where it clearly is with the Los Angeles Dodgers for now almost the better part of a decade. You see how far behind teams in your own division, or just period, your team is, watching it to get to that elite level.
We partner up with Bluebird Banter. You're used to hearing questions from the minor leaguer. This question for you, Ben, was simply, with the refurbished complex, the development center, have you seen it at all?
I have seen it. It is in its very final phases. The player development complex, which is different than the refurbished ballpark. For people that aren't familiar with the layout of Dunedin, Florida, where the Blue Jays play their spring training games, that's TD Ballpark. It had been refurbished, and it looks great. They did a tremendous job. It opened its doors last February. Now, the other ripple effect of a major investment from the Blue Jays, and obviously people here in Dunedin too, in local and state government, is some of the money's being poured into the player development complex, which in spring training, that's where pitchers and catchers report a lot of the early and off season and workouts and rehab continue to develop. That is going to be the feather in the cap, and a large piece of Mark Shapiro's legacy as he leads the Blue Jays, with what he is able to do to take the Blue Jays in a dilapidated state from player development and minor league or major league side over at the Bobby Maddock complex to what they're about ready to cut the ribbon on. It's in its very final phases. Paint is drying. They're hanging signs. They're doing all the finishing touches. By the end of October, it should open its doors, or early November. They're in about a 3-week window, I think, to really open it up and have players come in and use the facility. The fields that are there have been operational since spring training 1.0. There are 5 fields. There's basically split into 2 halves, where half of the complex will be minor leagues, half the complex will be major leagues. There's some shared space, and also the main nerve center, if you will, for the Blue Jays in that brand new building is also shared space. Shared space for coaches, shared space for trainers and high performance people, and obviously then the players that it can commingle as well. The major league side has their own clubhouse. Minor league side has their own clubhouse too. So there's still some separation and points to achieve from a player perspective that you want to get to. But walking through it before we left for summer camp and all that stuff, it's massive. It is beautiful. For the next 3 to 5 years, it should still be at the top of any facility that's out there in Major League Baseball, especially when it comes to the science that is available, the space that's available for sports science, and a lot of the data collection and testing that a lot of professional athletes and now franchises are becoming accustomed to using day in and day out. It will be an incredible display, whether visually, if you watch it on TV or just the photos. It will be impressive, and you cannot understate the size of this facility. It is massive. So but every piece of this structure is thought out, and not only thought out for right now, but then what's it going to look like in 10 years? If they need more space, if they need to reimagine some of the space, or if new technology, all of a sudden makes this big splash, can they implement it there? And the question is, they've thought about that, and they've hopefully built it out with that in mind. They have built it out with that in mind. And the hope is then to implement it seamlessly. So it's going to be, like I said, it's going to be Mark Shapiro's legacy. This thing is going to be a staple of the Blue Jays and their success, because of what they're able to accomplish with everybody from their first day signing out of high school or out of college as a professional baseball player to seeking after maybe the best free agent that's on the market, and using this as the presentation to be why you should become a Blue Jay, in this major phase of your career.
Lastly, I asked you about plans for the Blue Jays offseason. What are your plans for the offseason?
Wow. I'm going to try to not wear pants the entire offseason and enjoy this Florida weather, and just do some relaxing. From a personal standpoint, 2020 was really difficult for me, and not in terms of the broadcast, but with the border being closed, my wife and I were not able to see each other for 3 months. So I was brought to Toronto to do the broadcast. Unfortunately, with the border being closed and no cross-border traffic, my wife couldn't join us in Toronto. And we love Toronto. We love to experience Toronto together. And especially in the summer months, the baseball months are the best time of year to be in Toronto. And that's a massive void for us in our marriage. So obviously we're looking forward to getting back to Toronto whenever we can, and to enjoy the city as we have enjoyed the last couple of years together. So in the early stages of this off season, my wife and I are just hanging out, and reconnecting after a long 3-month gap. And hopefully those days and those restrictions are behind us, and we can get into 2021 with some sort of normalcy, and as we all hope to, for friends, families, and loved ones, that we can have those opportunities to reconnect. But that's especially for me, what I'm going to do this off season. And then in a few short weeks, when free agent trackers start to, find out these 6-year free agents that are looking for jobs, and the Blue Jays start to make roster decisions, I'm back to work, and I've taken so much of this past experience from this past year on how I'm going to do things differently moving forward, just in case. And a lot of the heavy lifting happens, for me in November, December, and January, so I can hit the ground running when spring training arrives. So that's kind of it. That's kind of it in a nutshell. And just hanging out in Florida and hopefully reconnecting with a lot of my friends and colleagues along the way.
Here's to your pantsless preparation for next year.
Yes, we do the interviews from the top up. That's why.
Radio voice of the Toronto Blue Jays, Ben Wagner. Ben, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. It's great to talk to you again.